If I were to ask someone, tell me the story of David and Goliath, they would tell me that there was this giant, he came and fought against the Israelites, and it was a wonderful opportunity to show the faith of David. And they would be exactly right. That's the right story. But the Bible tells it a little bit differently. The Bible scopes it in geography. In 1 Samuel 17, it starts off and says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and so they were gathered at Soka, which belongs to Judah, and Soka is located just along that ridge over there on the eastern end of the valley." And they encamped between Soka and Azekah. Now Azekah sits just around the corner here. So we are in between Soka and Azekah. It said Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up a line of battle against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, that mountain over there, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with a valley in between them. And that's how the Bible sets up this story. Then it introduces the main characters of the story.
Well, then later on we know that when David finally went down to battle with Goliath, he didn't use any of Saul's armor or his sword, but he crosses a brook and picks up 5 smooth stones.
Right, and of course we just crossed the brook ourselves right here below us.
So he would have come down from the Israelite camp, crossed that brook, and then gone down into the valley.
That's exactly right. Then David came out here and faced the giant, and I believe at that point he gives one of the most moving speeches that's in all of the Bible. Such a beautiful speech, and of course we know that as soon as he finished that, he took one of those stones, put it in his sling, and killed Goliath.
The writer of 1 Samuel is establishing David as Saul's replacement. He's the next anointed, he's the next king. And to be here, it's not just another story, it's not just another myth. It fits the geography of the land, and he puts so much attention and detail into that to help us establish that. Every culture lionizes its heroes. They glorify and exaggerate facts. It's easy to think, and I know that there are skeptics who do, they read the David and Goliath story and think, well, that's just so made up. But with what Barry pointed out, it's so rooted in accurate geography, even subtle details in this quest for, was this real? Did it actually happen? It fits the history of the period between the Philistines and the Israelites.
Okay, so let's pray. Father, we just thank you for your presence this morning. We come to you this morning with open hearts, open minds, just a readiness to hear the word this morning, that Lord, your word says that faith comes by hearing, and hearing the word of God. And so, Lord, I pray today that you would birth faith in hearts today as they hear the word, that you'd bring courage, you'd bring strength, you'd bring clarity of thought as your Spirit, the Spirit of truth, comes and speaks with us. Lord, we look to you as this event, as a very personal event in which you're involved with us, that it is a work of the Holy Spirit as we respond to you. And so, God, we are looking with the eyes of faith and expectancy that you are going to speak and that you are speaking. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. So, as you probably guessed from that clip, we're going to look at the story of David and David and Goliath. And so, but I was, in contemplating this message, I was just thinking about the fact that here we are, the anniversary, 1 year, and just even having the Birdman coming this year and having to cancel a year ago kind of reminds us of the fact that our lives changed a lot about a year ago as we began to navigate that whole thing. And over the next 12 months, the 2 weeks of shutdown became a year of shutdown for many people. And so I just want to really bring a word of faith, an encouraging word that will build many of you up and will bring hope and strength and faith and confidence now moving forward. So this event that we just saw occurred 3,000 years ago. To me, it's kind of amazing that we can actually locate the precise place where the battle between the Philistines and Israel took place, where David faced off with Goliath. I mean, that to me is just amazing in itself, but that's one of the things that's profound about the Bible itself, is that it has so much specificity when it comes to some of these events. And what they're saying is that lends toward the idea basically of authenticity. And you can corroborate the facts and the story. The only part of the story that seems remarkable is what David actually accomplished. And facing off with this giant, 9-foot giant. And so here we are looking at Goliath. We're going to be working through the book of the chapter 17 in 1 Samuel this morning. And so this occurred about 1000 BC, or about 3,000 years ago. That's a long time ago. And so this giant, this Philistine giant, we're going to read about him in just a moment, was about, the Bible describes him, he's about 9 feet tall. So if you're thinking 9 feet tall, I'm just under 6 feet tall. So add about 3 feet to my height. You know, I can't even reach to that point where 3 feet would be. That would be, I mean, this is one big guy. And so they're putting him forward as their champion warrior, and he's challenging and mocking Israel. And so the Bible actually specifies how heavy the tip of his spear was, because it's so heavy, just the tip of it. And how his armor was so elaborate, and his helmet and his shield and breastplate, and he was just armed to the hilt. And so it wasn't going to be an easy kill if somebody's going to take him out, because he was well defended, and he had his armor bearer there with him. And so as we look, let's just begin reading through the story. So it says, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel. And of course, in that valley we were just looking at, if you can kind of picture these armies on both sides, and that they go out into the middle of this flat kind of valley area, and they have this contest in the middle of this plain with both armies watching on, almost like a giant amphitheater. Really kind of cool to see that. So he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel. And what does Goliath say? He says, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, or are you not the servants of Saul?" Now, when he says servants of Saul, he's belittling them, you understand. He's basically saying they're like Saul's, little people that serve him, and they're subservient. And he says, "Choose a man and have him come down to me, if he is able to fight and kill me. We will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." In other words, be our slaves. Then the Philistine says, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. So Goliath was beating Israel at this point by fear alone. In other words, he's intimidating them, his stature, but as far as they have an entire army, but they're cowing down because one guy is a loudmouth and he's tall. And they're paralyzed by this fear. But they have an entire army on the mountain looking over this whole thing. So why would they be afraid? And I thought about this, and I was thinking about how fear paralyzes. And I think as a country, we've become paralyzed by our own fear. I think that in a lot of ways, we have a Goliath beating his chest and shouting at us and telling us all these things. And I was thinking about it the other day. I was watching people. Jeanette was going into one of the stores, and I was waiting outside. And I decided to do an analysis. I was watching. And I told her, I said, I didn't see a sign on that store. I didn't see, maybe there was, maybe inside, I don't know. But I didn't see a sign. But so I did an analysis, and I thought, okay, so these people were all going in. I could see them all putting their mask on as they head into the store. And I thought, okay, what's the odds? In other words, I started doing a survey. What are the odds? And it looked to me that maybe, at the most, 1 in 10 was walking in that store without a mask. One of them was my wife. She didn't, a lot of these stores are wide open. They're not trying to force you to have a mask or to do anything. In other words, Texas has been released of all of the mandate. In other words, it's ollie income free, as we used to say when we were playing hide and seek. It means you can come in now and you won't get caught. It's okay. It's safe. You can come in now. It's all right. And I thought about it, and I'm watching people with their masks. I see them outdoors. I see them cycling. I see them in their cars. I still see them after all this time. And I always think to myself, they say follow the science. And I look at it and I go, okay, if we're going to follow the science, then why are we masking? Okay, so what metric are we waiting for to say it's safe? Is it a caseload? Is it hospitalizations? Is it death? In other words, at what point are we finally going to say, okay, it's over? And I think the governor is about the closest thing we may get, is saying, okay, we're done, in Texas. And there's about, maybe 20 states now that have done something similar. And so what I decided was that most people are walking in these stores masking not because they're afraid of catching a disease. Some of them probably are. I'm sure some of them are. But I don't think they are. I'm watching them. They're already masking in the parking lot alone. You going to catch a disease in the parking lot? It's dutiful. This is a proper thing to do. Here's what I think it is. I do think it's fear-based. I think it's all fear-based, but not because people really believe they're going to catch a disease. Not in Corpus Christi, not at this time. I don't think that's a real factor. I think they don't want to be the first one to get in trouble. I don't think they want to be that guy. I don't think they want to be the one that walks in HEB and somebody says, you're going to have your mask. And HEB's been relaxed about it for months. They really don't care. But everybody continues to compliant and dutiful and, I don't see any of you wearing masks. And I think if there was an announcement in front of these stores that said, hey, we just want y'all to know, you don't need to wear a mask here. It's okay. I think if that was being conveyed as people were coming in, I think half of them would take their masks off like that. I've had it happen where I would be meeting somebody in Sam at Coffee Ways where there's no masking, and I'll see people just coming in with their masks on, and I'll just tell somebody as I'm meeting with them, I say, you don't have to mask here, and they go, oh. They take it off, smiling, like, oh, good, what a relief. And I think a lot of people are like that. So I've theorized, and I'd love to do a survey. Maybe we should do a survey. I'd go out there and interview people with a clipboard and say, so tell me, are you afraid of the disease now? Or are you afraid of being shunned and shamed because you're not wearing a mask, because you're an awful person? And I think most of them, honestly, I think most people out there are just doing it because they are terrified of being disapproved, of experiencing disapproval from total strangers that they'll never see again. Shame on us. And that makes me concerned about America, because I'm like, does anybody have any backbone anymore? In other words, where's the metric that we're looking for that finally says, you don't have to do that anymore? So I think that metric came and went a long time ago, and the fact is that fear is what's paralyzing us as a people, as a country. And it's not that much different than Israel being paralyzed by the fear that they had at that moment facing off with Goliath. I'll bet you anything. If there was somebody here masking, I wouldn't want to shun or shame you in that sense, okay? I don't see anybody, so it's kind of almost safe to say this, except if they're online. Masking in their living room. Okay. But how many of us? But obviously we don't believe in it at this point. We'll mask at HEB because we're afraid, when HEB doesn't care. In other words, we don't, see what I'm saying? In other words, we also need to shake off the intimidation. Somebody's got to set a precedent. It ought to be us. It might as well be us. Now, I'm not going to go face those armed guards at Sprouts. I'll just go to another store. Yeah, I'm in that Facebook group. We're all talking about. I changed barbers because my barber says, no, we're going to keep masking. I'm like, why? Why? I like where I've been going. You don't have to do that anymore. Okay, so they're at a stalemate. Fear has paralyzed the armies of Israel. It says, for 40 days the Philistines came forward Every morning, the Philistines are the arch enemies of Israel for many, many years, hundreds of years. It says, for 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took this stand. So in the morning, he comes, he mocks them, he eggs them on, and then they all have to listen to it, and it's apparently like scheduled. Like, oh gosh, we got to put up with him again. Now it's, 4 in the afternoon, he's coming out to mock us again, and we're just going to... And so there's no way for them to take ground at this point. They're just stuck. It's a humiliating circumstance that seemed never ending. When Jesus was telling the disciples, he said, and I tell you, you are Peter, the Petros, and on this rock, the Petra, the large foundational stone, I will build my church. And the gates of Hades, some translations say the gates of hell, will not overcome it. And so how does a gate attack you? So the whole concept here is that Jesus is saying that the gates which you are charging, which you are assaulting, they cannot withstand you. It's not suggesting, in his whole context here, he's not suggesting that we're waiting passively while the gates attack us. Gates don't have legs. They don't come after you. In other words, there has to be a point where we move forward. And this applies to our lives and individual lives, not just our country or not just our community, but it applies to how we approach our lives. And sometimes we can be so passive or so paralyzed by our own fear that we're at a standstill. We're not moving forward. And so sometimes those gates are out there, and the only way they're coming down, the only way they're breaking through is we have to charge them. And that's why Jesus is saying, that, on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. In other words, the gates will not be able to withstand the authority and the determination of the church. The ancient gates. The gates are saying to us, you can't win. You'll never prevail. You can't have them. You will not enter the castle or the fortress. You cannot break through. The gates are an intimidation. They're a barrier. And we all have barriers. We all have obstacles that we're facing. So David, verse 26, asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Okay, so he's just asking a question. And it's going to get him in a lot of trouble. You ever asked a question that just got you in trouble? It was obviously not a passive question. He was stirred. He was looking for an answer. He wanted to understand, what on earth are we doing? See, you have to understand, David was a young man. He was a young adult. What do they know? He'd been on the backside of the pasture. He'd been guarding the sheep. And so he has been sent by his dad, Jesse. Jesse sent him and said, I want you to bring his brothers if they're serving in the army of Israel. His older brothers. And so his dad says, go check on your brothers. Let me know how they're doing. And bring them some food. It actually tells, some of the food items that he brought them. High carb food. Need a lot of energy to fight with Goliath and the Philistines. And so David comes walking in there. He's observing this whole ordeal unfolding, which he had no idea. He's walking in as an outsider looking in, and he starts asking these questions, and it just aggravated everybody. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Wow. See, we have to remember who we are. Israel forgot who they were. In the middle of this whole mess for the last 12 months, we need to remember who we are. Was David the only one deeply concerned about the honor and reputation of God? See, David's approach was not kind of like, hey guys, we can do better. We got to have some guys here that can really fight this thing. Don't we have somebody? That wasn't what bothered him, that Israel wasn't stepping out. What bothered him was that this Philistine was there insulting, God's people, God's interests, God's kingdom, God's ways, and he's not giving account for it. How can you let this go? How can you give him a free pass? Look at the name and the reputation and honor of God. Do you guys even care anymore? David was sent by dad, right? So in verse 28 it says, his brothers, one of his older brothers says to David, "Why have you come down here? I mean, why are you here? Don't you?" And David could have gone, "Don't you appreciate it? I brought you some bread, and I brought you some food, some goodies, some snacks to help you get through your hard battle that you're fighting here with the Philistines." He could have responded like that. But this ends up being an accusation against him. Why have you come? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? Talk about demeaning. So he's insulting him. He's telling him, okay, so David, little brother, little boy, you had a few sheep. Fine, whatever, you baby. So who did you leave the few sheep with? Anybody could do the job. You see what he's implying? Anybody can do that job. How hard could it be anyway? What are you doing here? And he says, "And I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle, didn't you?" And David's reactions, typical sibling, he goes, "Now what have I done? Can I say something? Am I not allowed to speak? Am I not allowed to say anything?" It's like, so he's putting this motive on him. You're just down here because you want to see the action. You just want to see the blood and the fighting and all that. You just want to be entertained. That's all you're about. Often that we can accuse people of the things that we ourselves are guilty of. You ever notice that? You see it in the political world all the time, where one side will begin to accuse the other side of the very things they are guilty of. That may be more nefarious and deceptive, but what we do sometimes from a kind of inside our hearts is that if we have a bitter spirit, we interpret others' actions as also having a bitter spirit. Or if we have a jealous spirit, we interpret the actions of others as also having jealousy. If we have pride, we look at others that may be doing certain things or making certain types of choices, and we see and we interpret, we filter, because we have the pride, we interpret and filter that individual must also have the same pride. And so we deflect, we transfer our own problem onto this other person. We're filtering. You ever done that? It's really wise if you do that and you can catch yourself. Like, the reason that person bothers me so much is they have some of the same problems I have. Especially young people, ambitious people that are trying to, gain favor and traction and position and prestige and trying to maybe build their company or their ministry, or they're trying to get through college. And so it's easy to step back and go, well, they obviously can't have a good motive in what they're doing. They've got to be evil like I am. But you don't think of it that way. You don't say, they're not evil like me, they're just evil. We don't see the mirror that's looking back at us. It's really kind of a rude awakening when you realize that sometimes the things we're bothered about another person are actually the things that we're doing. So I have a notable thought for you. This is a short one. They're usually longer. David's first battle was the battle for the mind. The victory must be won there first. He was demeaned and insulted, those few sheep, little boy, you're here for entertainment, you have evil motives, you were stirring up the pot, you're just trying to make trouble, you're trying to push our buttons, trying to get us to do something we maybe shouldn't do. You're just a boy, you're not a warrior. It's not your place. You are out of your league. Don't quit your day job, David. Go back to your sheep. This is not your realm. This is not this is not your place. Go away. That was the position. That he had to overcome. He had to deflect that. He had to somehow realize that what they're telling him had no bearing on the truth. The truth was he knew who he was. He knew his relationship with God, and he knew what God had taught him. And he knew that he had something to bring to the table if nobody else was willing. So he's just talking tough, but he has something behind it to back it up. Nobody else was even talking tough. He's the only one in the entire army of Israel that was even talking tough. Like, who's this guy think he is? Can defy the armies of Israel, armies of God. Who does he think he is? And so this was overheard by the king, King Saul. So King Saul sends for him. Hey, bring that boy over here. We'll talk to the young man. In other words, David is saying all this stuff, and sometimes what we're saying sets things in motion, for good or bad. I mean, we need to be careful about what we're saying. Saul heard these words, and it set something in motion. In this case, it was a good thing. King Saul, desperately needed an out. This has been going for 40 years, and he was humiliated every single day because it was really his job to face the giant. The Holy Spirit had departed Saul. Saul was lacking a confidence, a sense of empowerment that God had given him when he was anointed king. But he was under judgment, so Saul had a gnawing sense that he had lost his footing and he had no confidence in God. But he's still king. And he's trying to figure out, how do I get out of this mess? So he's so desperate because there's nobody else, there's no other alternative. He figures maybe this kid knows something I don't know. So David says to Saul when he faces the king, he says, don't let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. He says, I'll go take care of it. This is an amazing conversation. Here's a young man facing with the king, and he's placed in that place because he spoke with such brashness and boldness. So the king is like, and so that David is going, I've got this. I've got this. See, nothing to worry about here. I've got it. I'll take care of it. It's not a big deal. It's not a problem. The irony of David, the shepherd boy, David the youngest, looked down upon by his brothers, and he's saying, calm down. It's no big deal. So sometimes it falls to us to step into a battle that others seem more trained and qualified to do. Others seem to be the first and the best choice. David saw a need that he knew he could meet. He was a man of action. I think it's interesting. It would be interesting to kind of interview a lot of these pro-life women that were elected to the U.S. Congress recently. I think there were 14 of them. It'd be interesting to analyze or to interview all of them. And I think sometimes what you find out is that some of these people are just like moms and housewives and people that were otherwise trying to mind their own business, but they just couldn't take it anymore. I have the ability to do something about this. If nobody else will do it, I think there are people that are maybe more qualified than me. But, I've said it for years. Of course, people don't balance checkbooks anymore. But I've always thought, when you used to balance a checkbook, and sometimes the wife would balance the checkbook or whoever in the household. I've thought for years, what we need is people running the government that know how to balance a checkbook. And so I've thought to myself sometimes that maybe just putting the moms in charge of everything, we might be better off. So, y'all like that? Okay. All right, so let me know when you're starting your campaign. It'd be a new movement. The pro-life moms rise to the occasion, ready to change America. But it's really true that sometimes we think others are so much more qualified, but in fact, it may be us. In fact, as far as what God has done in us and what He's developed in us and where He's brought us and what He's brought us through, that there may be a time when we have to step up. And it may not be in the political realm, it may be in some other realm where we have to step up. It's our turn. But yet we're terrified to walk in a store without a mask on. Oh, I don't know, I can't do that. Somebody's going to offer me a mask. Would you like a mask? Oh, no, thank you. They're going to put me in jail. Okay, so I have an interesting little clip. It's about a minute or so long. And you probably don't know who this man is. His name is Audie Murphy, and he is the most decorated combat veteran in World War II. But the reason I want to mention him is he had an amazing gift, but he was rejected first by two branches of the military. When Pearl Harbor hit, Audie was like, I want to join, I want to get in. I think he's like 19 years old or something, or 18. And so he's like, I want to join, I got to get in the fight. And nobody would let him in the fight. He was so frustrated. And so let me play this. $112. Y'all didn't see that. Okay, so there actually was a movie made where he acted out himself in the movie because he was so young and he had that boyish face for so many years. He actually played his own heroic role in the movie. Instead of them hiring an actor, they just used him, and he became a very well-known actor and country singer, and he died in a plane accident in I think he was about 46 years old, 1971. But anyway, he was a remarkable young man. He had a set of gifts that were profound. But if you imagine for a moment, he weighed 112 pounds. No wonder they turned him away. How are you going to be able to handle the hardship of combat? How are you going to be able to keep up with anybody? How are you going to be able to carry that back? How are you going to be able to do, but he was extremely and highly motivated and high achiever. He was fearless, and that was part of what really set him aside. Is he would jump into battle, he would improvise, he would take risks that nobody else was willing to take, and they called him the luckiest man of the war because of how many times the bullets missed him. And there was one of the most famous scenes for him was when there was a tank that was burning. It was already on fire, and it was expected to explode at any moment. But there was a .50 caliber machine gun sitting on top, and so he went up on top of that tank and grabbed hold of the .50 caliber machine gun and took charge of the battlefield. And everybody's just like, "Are you nuts? Are you out of your mind?" And so, he literally took charge of the whole battlefield. That was one among many. He was wounded 3 times. So he's an amazing young man. He was really young. He was a young adult. And so I wanted you to see kind of his background as you look at him and go, I kind of identify him like a David. It's funny how people would look at David and go, well, I just don't know how a young boy, how could that be a real true story? That's just a fable. It's just a make-believe. That's why I was giving you the first clip. Because I thought, but at the same time we look at Audie Murphy and we go, well, that can't be, that's got to be make-believe. Well, to me, what Audie Murphy accomplished is similar to what David accomplished. In the profound, they call it a miracle. They say it was impossible what he did. He has so many medals that you can't even, it's almost like his entire military jacket is just nothing but medals. And so, but what he did was remarkable. And the fact is that sometimes people that you don't expect, you look at his background, you look at his education, he even became an officer eventually, which was kind of unusual too because he didn't have a college degree. But in wartime, you know, people were promoted quickly because of the casualty rates. But I think to myself, wow, David was like that. He was profound. He was, but yet his background, he was the youngest of the clan, and there was some stigma on him as well regarding that. He was resented by his brothers. He was back on the backside. He wasn't part of the army. He wasn't, and so you see, yet he accomplished one of the greatest victories Israel ever known in history was ever accomplished through this one young man. It set in motion a rout of the Philistine army. It set in motion a tremendous victory for Israel. And it declared that God is truly with Israel. And so you all know the outcome. You know what happens. But we'll go into that a little bit. So the contest begins. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. He said, I can't go in these. It's because I'm not used to them. So he took them off, all the armor, the sword, everything. He took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, from that stream in the video. 5 smooth stones. When I went to Israel, I wish I could have gone to that stream. I would have picked up 5 smooth stones. I don't know if they'd have let me take them out. I might have been going out of the country with a little bit of a heavy pack. I don't know. I guess if everybody went there and took 5 smooth stones, could create a shortage of smooth stones. He says he took them off. He took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, from the brook, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with a sling in his hand approached the Philistine. So what I find fascinating, it doesn't say the armor was too big for him. I used to kind of picture this like he's a little scrawny boy like Audie Murphy, 112 pounds, and he's putting this armor on that's too big for him. But that's actually not what he said. What he said was, I'm not used to it. I'm not skilled with it. I'm not trained. In other words, I'm not trained to use your method of warfare, but I am trained another way. And I'm not going to go out there and, with just some sort of symbolic regalia on me, some armor and some different things to make me look like when I know that it's just going to hinder me and I'm not going to be able to operate at efficiency, and I need to have my head in the game. I don't want to be distracted by having a bunch of junk hanging on my body that's going to keep me from being able to do what I need to do. It's really interesting. So David, bottom line, he was more concerned about what would actually work rather than doing what's always been done. He was a pragmatist when it came down to how he's going to fight this battle. And he also knew what he was good at. And he was not going to be influenced by Saul's expectations that he has to look and appear a certain way to go into battle. I ask this question all the time when we're doing ministry. What do we need to do differently? How can we approach this? How can we be more effective? I remember quite a number of years ago, we did a major outreach on campus, and we rented 3 vans. We put a lot of money into it. We had a huge bonfire and hot dogs, and we had our guest card tables and watermelon and all this stuff up to reach incoming students. This was a number of years ago. And I determined after that, because we had like 150 students come to this thing. We had van loads full of students, freshmen, coming to our event. You know how many of them we reached? As far as I know, 0. How many of them actually came to the net the next week or the week after that and actually came on a Friday night or whatever, our young adult meeting? How many that we know of that came to 150 that came to our event? 0. The problem was we could look at that event and go, man, look at how many of them came. Look at how awesome this was. Wow, we were really busy, weren't we? Yeah, well, we were just busy feeding the campus watermelon and hot dogs. And we were reaching no one. And I said, I'm not going to do that again. There's no point in that. Yeah, it was exciting, and we felt like we were busy, and we had our hopes up, and we're thinking we can reach a few people, and we reached, as far as I know, looking back at that single event, we did not reach a single person. Like, well, we're just not going to do that. We're going to do something else. Maybe we'll run around on campus with inflatable dinosaurs or something. Probably reach more people doing that. We had a young lady in our church for a while who was a cheerleader, and she could do these back, what do you call those things? Yeah, those. Yeah, that. And she would do them, and I'd say, just do those over and over in front of our table on campus. You know, on the concrete. She was good. And she was one of the young people that we reached at that time. And so we probably reached more people just having her doing, what do you call them? Back handsprings. We might have reached more people having her do back handsprings than having 150 people come to the beach. So anyway, just thoughts about how we need to also be practical and pragmatic. If something's not working, don't force it. And as a pastor, a lot of times I have to sit back and go, well, you know, I don't see that that's really working or that this season is appropriate for that particular event or that particular activity. Let's just step back and give it a breather and then look at what we need to do now. So verse 41, meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome. Now, him being healthy and handsome is not going to win this battle, ladies and gentlemen. Some people think that will win them the battle. Well, I'm healthy and I'm handsome. Isn't there anything more? And it says he looked at him, he said, healthy and handsome, and he goes, he despised him. He says to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks, meaning his shepherd's staff? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Now, they didn't tell us what he actually said. Just a summary. He cursed him by his gods. Okay, so we don't have to know what he actually said. He says, come here, you punk, come here. You know, I told one of my grandkids yesterday, he's 3. I said, you're a punk. And you know what he did? I love this. He goes, I'm not a punk, you're a punk. 3 years old. Howard. I know. I was taken back. I felt like Goliath stepping back and going, oh my goodness. What confidence exudes from this little boy. He's healthy and handsome, but he's tough. Sheesh. So I didn't continue, Goliath and backing down. I mean, okay, I'm a punk. Come here, I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. So it's a word picture. He's drawing a word picture. This is your future, David. This is what's coming. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. So, nice 1-2 punch here. I mean, so the other guy's like, I'm going to feed you the birds and animals, I'm going to eat you, and you're just a punk, and I'm going to, David turns around, he's like, oh yeah? And who would you going to believe more when you listen to the conviction, when you listen to the one is just relying on his clout and size and his reputation as a giant. But David actually believes he's taking this man down. I'm going to cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals. So not only you, but everybody else. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give all of you into our hands. So we have to remember, whatever the battle is that we're in, whatever we're fighting, we have to remember that we need to keep our armor on. And to understand that the battle that we face, whether it's a local thing or whether it's a personal battle or whether it's a battle for the heart and soul of our country, we have to understand that this battle, we as Christians, as believers, we have to take a posture of faith. And understand that whatever ground we take, we need to take it in behalf of God and His honor and His name's sake. The Philistine moved closer to attack him. So they're both out there in the field. They're coming in like this. David, so he's moving closer, probably, fee, fi, fo, fum. Fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell the blood of a punky shepherd. They didn't have Englishmen yet. And so David, it says, ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag, takes out a stone. He slung it, struck the Philistine in the forehead, the one spot where there's no armor. He had to get this right, y'all. He didn't have a lot of leeway, not a lot of margin of error. The stone sank into his forehead, so his skull is bending with the rock. It sank into his forehead and he fell face down to the ground. So he had, at least at this point, a severe concussion. When I was in 5th grade, I really did this. I had heard this story when I was a kid. I wasn't like a real church kid, but somehow I had this story in my mind. I don't know where I got the idea, but I went and made myself a sling. And I lived in West Texas, and so I had, the two. I had a pouch, and then I had the 2 ropes, and I'd attach it to my finger, and I would do it over and over and over, and I'd sling it and throw those rocks. Well, it was in West Texas, so there were lots of rocks, especially in the alley area behind the house. Lots of these white, rocks. They were the right size. And so, man, I would take that sling. You can hear it. It's amazing how good I got at it. And I thought, how accurate can I be with this? How can I? It was really kind of amazing what I had developed. I was only in 5th grade, so using the leverage of that centrifugal force and throwing that rock and hurling it out was really amazing. I spent hours doing it, trying to develop the skill. I'm not sure why. I was kind of an inventor. I like to create things and invent things, and so this was kind of one thing I thought, well, I want to learn how to do this. I don't know if this is kind of odd, but this is how the work of God is done. It says David ran quickly toward the battle line. We put everything into it. We pursue the battle. All of us may have a Goliath in our lives. Or at least from time to time, there'll be something you're facing off with in your life. And it represents kind of a Goliath in your life. And there's a few things that you have to do to be able to take on that Goliath. First thing is you must win the battle of the mind. You have to know who you are. You have to know what the Word says. You have to know. David knew the promise of God, but he also knew what God had taught him in the wilderness, on the backside of the shepherd's pasture. We must win the battle of the mind. We must break the stalemate, the standoff of fear. And I'll stand by this. Listen, guys, I believe the fear that we have in our country and have had over the last year has done far more damage than the virus ever did. You just look at it. You can map the studies out. I was saying, looking at the excess deaths from the CDC, and I look at that and I go, well, it's just about at normal now. Excess deaths meaning that of all causes, deaths are about where they're supposed to be. But there should be no death at all. I have news for you, ladies and gentlemen. We all die at some point. But when you look at the excess death chart, you have to understand that a lot of the people that are in those curves have died as a result of the fear of it. Look at all the fear. How many people refuse to go to the hospital when they desperately needed help for a lot of other treatments? And we could go on and on with that. The people that have had anxiety attacks and the suicide rate, all these things that have happened because we have become a society dominated by this fear. And as believers, we have got to get a hold of that. And there are a few times in the middle of this last year, I think, oh man, I don't want to get that thing. And I take my vitamins every day. I take my calcium and just, the whole regimen. I want to be sensible. I want to have common sense about it. But at the same time, I don't want my life to be dominated by fear, where I'm not functional anymore, where I'm terrified, or where I'm, or you can feel it. You say, oh, man, I'm 65. I could get it. And then what? Listen, your mind can just start going with this stuff. So you have to bring those thoughts captive. We can say, I'm not going to be dominated by fear. I'm going to live my life, and I'm going to live it with quality, and with joy and satisfaction, and realize that we have work to do. We have a mission to accomplish. And so there are other kinds of fears that people face and they deal with, but we have to bring those in subjection. I have many stories I can tell. I've had times where people were facing really horrific diseases and found out that doing spiritual warfare over them, that often the fear of the disease was actually opening up more of an opportunity for the enemy than the disease itself. And so instead of actually praying, I remember a lady that had just huge, horrible, cyclical, I can't even remember, the disease was so complicated. I don't know if they even really understood it or what was causing it, but she would swell up and her belly would get huge, and she decided to start coming to my church. She'd been kind of healed of it for a while, walked free of it from a revival meeting, and then it started coming back, and I'm like, and then they started attending my church. This is my church in another life. And so I'm like, God, what am I going to do? How am I going to deal with this thing, And the Lord spoke to me. He showed me the scripture that says this demon, this spirit would come and seize her. In other words, I thought, okay, so the demon that's tormenting her is not there all the time. It's just there. It's just there when it comes, and then it brings the symptoms. And so I realized the open door in her life was the fear. And so she had this thing. I said, you tell me, you let me know when the symptoms start coming. Because, she would be deathly ill. She would go in the hospital every time. And the doctors are just like, what do? We just drug her up. There's nothing else to do for her. And her belly would just swell up. It would look like she was pregnant, at 8 months or something. It was just an awful, painful, tormenting disease. And now I'm her pastor. And I feel responsible. And so I told her, I said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get a game plan. And the Lord spoke to me. It says this thing comes and seizes you. So it's not there all the time. So if we do spiritual warfare last week, the thing isn't here. We need to deal with it when it comes. Make sense? And so she started getting symptoms. I said, come to my house. I had a circle of prayer warriors. I said, like 3 or 4 people. I don't even remember who they were. I said, we're going to have 3 or 4 people. We're going to pray over you. We're going to do warfare. But the thing that really came out in that warfare was the fear, the opening of fear, because she was so terrified of the next seizure, the next session, the next hospital stay, the pain of it all. And so I started relating to her in terms of the fear she was walking through. And it was when we could start dealing on that level that we defeated that thing, and she walked free of it for at least the next few years. But that was tactical. It was spiritual, but I'm relating that story so you'll understand that the root of it was fear. And a lot of times people do not realize that when they walk in fear and all this anxiety, that they're actually opening themselves up for the attack of the enemy. We've got to be alert to that. We've got to be on top of this. So we must break the stalemate, the standoff of fear. We must be willing to take a risk and fight. So number 3, the presentation. You love the presentation. David ran. Okay, so he's killed him. The thing went in his forehead. We haven't taken his pulse. We don't know for sure. But for all practical purposes, he's out. So he cuts his head off. We know when his head is removed, he is dead for sure. And if he's an immortal, he's still dead. So you got to cut their heads off. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine sword, now a sword's coming in handy, and drew it from the sheath. He's like drawing it from the sheath, this long sword. He's picking his sword up. He killed him, after he killed him. So apparently there was another act of execution. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. I know this is a little grisly, but it is one of the greatest stories of all time about victory and overcoming odds. And some of my pacifist friends struggle with these passages. But God is not a pacifist. If you haven't figured that out, just read the Bible. Jesus isn't a pacifist either. David took I saw a bunch of y'all in that license to carry class yesterday. We had like 22 people in the license to carry class, so now we have to have another class. The 22 were not all from this church. About half of them were from our church. So I said, okay, well now we need to have another class, and that is a tactical class and maybe a deeper and more thorough training on handling firearms. So can see, half our church coming in armed and somebody walks in with a ski mask. I'm like, okay, all right, guys, just hold on here. Hold on. Hold it. I'm like, wait a minute. Hold it. Okay. That's not in my notes. Maybe it's a fear. No. You know the license to carry laws, you know what they are. They're the poor man's security guard. We can't hire a security guard. We can't afford that. So the state of Texas has given we the people the privilege of being able to defend ourselves and to carry firearm. And so essentially really kind of an amazing thing. If you had asked me 25 years ago and said, or you could predict the future and you say, 25 years from now, that they're going to let you carry guns all over Texas all the time? Like even open or concealed, doesn't matter. You guys are going to be armed to the hilt and you're going to be carrying these guns everywhere. And you can even carry them in the state capitol while they're in session. And if you told me that, I said, you are out of your mind. There is no way that will ever happen on this green earth. But it happened. Life is full of surprises. So, off track. David ran, cut off his head. Here's what I want you to get. David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. Okay, now I want you to picture this. He's a young adult, and he's got the head of a giant. And a head is pretty heavy. If you've ever picked one up, you ever just like pick up your own head and just kind of like, how heavy is it? And then picture a head twice as big, and that you're carrying it around probably by the hair or the beard or whatever, and he's carrying this thing around everywhere, probably getting his arm sore. Like. So David is carrying the head around. He carries it to Jerusalem. Here's what I want you to get. This is a display of victory, and so it's much like what Jesus did. He displayed his victory. In Colossians it says this, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, Jesus on the cross, which stood against us and condemned us, he has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. Here's what I want you to get. When Jesus did all this on the cross, it says, having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. The allusion here, or the language here, is alluding to the Roman triumphant marches. Okay, when they would come in and they vanquish their enemies, and their enemies are in the procession, and they're humiliating them. It's a similar kind of thing, and what it's saying is that Jesus essentially did that regarding his enemies. And that's part of what we have to grasp, is that God has waged a victory in our behalf that we have to appropriate. The enemy has been put to open shame, much like the Roman procession after a great battle victory. The triumphal procession, public and humiliating display of the vanquished forces, prisoners in complete subjection. This is what Jesus did. Before all of heaven and before the universe, we now have, he has placed within us, the strategic advantage. It is a cosmic checkmate. The very end of this, verse 59, as soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul. And Saul, still holding, and with David, he brings him before the king. So he says, and David, with David still holding the Philistine's head. He's had that dang thing around his, holding that thing for who knows how long. Days, weeks, maybe months. He's carrying that head around. It's a nasty business. And he goes, here's David holding the head of the Philistine. And Saul says to him, whose son are you, young man? Where did you come from? Who is that masked man? And David says, I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem. And so the question to us is, when we understand who we are and we begin to take a stand and we begin to overcome fear and we begin to break the standoff, then there's a point as we walk with a certain stride, our shoulders are back, our chin is up, and we're walking through life with an air of confidence. I don't think I read the scripture, I must have skipped it, where David's telling them, I killed a bear and I killed a lion and I had the skills and I can do this. And I can kill this giant too. He knew who he was. He knew what he could do. He knew what he could accomplish. Whose son are you? And so in a sense, the question then comes to each one of us. Whose son are you? And I believe that as we walk this out with the Lord and we walk with some confidence and we have our shoulders back and our chin up, that people essentially will look at you not because you have a great heritage or because you have all these, qualifications. But as we serve him, as we seek to live for him, we point people toward our Father. Whose son are you? So I'm going to conclude here. There comes a point where we no longer need to live under the tyranny of our enemies. Would y'all stand with me? So when we face off in our lives, what is the head of the Goliath in your life? What is that head that we need to pick up and say, I'm cutting this head off and I'm moving forward with victory in my life. I'm not going to be in a standoff anymore. I'm ready to move forward. I'm ready to shake off the fear. The head of weariness and discouragement. The head of maybe some kind of looming divorce or strife within a family or a marriage. The head of fear and anxiety. The head of hurt and bitterness. Has that been holding us back? The head of perversion and immorality. The head of failure, defeat. The head of shame. The head of strife and division. The head of obesity. The head of poverty and lack. The head of drunkenness and addiction. The head of fruitlessness. In other words, we all have challenges, and these represent a head that we need to attack and come in faith in approaching that thing. Are y'all with me?